Rebonsoir ou bonjour, pardon, rebonjour à tous et à toutes. Merci de nous rejoindre pour cette dernière conférence de la journée sur l'événement Repenser l'industrie agroalimentaire à l'ère du numérique. Dans un instant, nous allons recevoir Bertrand et Peter qui vont me rejoindre. En attendant, je vous demanderai juste de vous souvenir des petites informations techniques. Comme d'habitude, pensez à utiliser l'onglet Q&R ou Q&A pour poser vos questions. Pensez bien à basculer de conférencier et participant de conférencier à conférencier et participants pour que tout le monde puisse bien vous lire dans le chat. Et je donne la parole et la scène à Bertrand et Peter. C'est à vous.
Merci Elsa. Bienvenue à la présentation de Barcoding Canada. Donc, je suis Bertrand Martel, directeur général pour le Canada et j'ai basé à Montréal. Et j'ai avec moi Peter Zalinski, notre directeur relations partenaires, mais surtout notre expert en chaîne d'approvisionnement et standards JS1, utilisé, comme vous le savez, dans l'industrie agroalimentaire. Le seul défaut de Peter, c'est qu'il ne parle pas français, mais cependant, je pense que son expertise va compenser ce manque. Donc pendant la session, n'hésitez pas à soumettre vos questions soit en français, soit en anglais. Après une très très brève introduction de Barcoding Canada, on partagera avec vous ce que nous voyons comme tendance sur l'automatisation de la chaîne d'approvisionnement et plus particulièrement l'évolution des technologies en automatisation dans les entrepôts, poussées par la recherche de nouveaux gains de productivité. Ensuite, on abordera le standard GS1 pour finir. So Peter, if you want to go to the next slide and the next one. Donc, très rapidement sur Barcoding Canada, donc notre mission, c'est d'automatiser les processus dans la chaîne d'approvisionnement. Les logiciels comme Fidelio, les ERP, demandent de plus en plus de données en temps réel, de données qui sont fiables, pour justement vous offrir des outils décisionnels à la pointe. Donc, notre raison d'être, c'est vraiment d'être le bras et les jambes des ERP pour les nourrir en données. Next one. Donc, si vous regardez notre couverture, on peut vous aider au Québec, bien sûr, mais aussi en Ontario, vers l'ouest. Et si vous avez des visées ou des besoins aux États-Unis, on est aux États-Unis. Notre siège social nord-américain est à Baltimore. Barcoding Canada est une division de Barcoding. Et donc, nous offrons de l'aide à travers l'Amérique du Nord. Peter?
So we're going to be talking a little bit about what we're seeing in the supply chain and in the industry. And if you're not already aware, we're already seeing some major disruptions today with the Suez Canal being blocked by a jackknifed container ship. So disruption is going to be part of our everyday within the supply chain. And we've noticed due to COVID and the joys of 2020, there were a lot of different influences that were coming to play with that. I would say in general, we're seeing a vast acceleration on digital transformation because people need to increase their resilience and be more agile within their supply chain. They've got to work on their people, their processes, and their technology to achieve more value, and they're doing it much quicker. I think the stats that I saw said that the expectations for supply chain transformation that were originally scheduled for 5 years out are now being achieved within the first 9 months of 2020 and 2021. So they're really accelerating that whole process. That means a large investment in enterprise and mobile, as well as investments in other forms of technology, everything from RFID and IoT to goods to person, and even automated storage and retrieval systems. For the companies that have the wherewithal to make the change, they're doing much better than the companies who battened down and just decided to hold off on making transformations. So as we kind of move forward into this, Wi-Fi and battery life are now becoming part of Maslow's hierarchy. Businesses that did embrace digital are doing much better than those who stuck with their manual processes and their disconnected environments. That digital divide between the do's and the didn'ts is growing wider, and those that are trying to bridge that gap are doing so rapidly. Digital, like they say, is no longer a nice to have, it's a must to have. So technology is not just the domain of IT. It covers all aspects of business, not just the floor where people are touched. Um, Everything's going to work much better if all four of these factors, IT, technology, operations, and finance, are working together. And we try to make that focus on connecting all of those parts and getting them to work in a unified manner. That's one of the things barcoding does. We're all about the people, the process, and the technology, getting them all to work together well to remain efficient, accurate, and connected, and become more so. So what are we talking about in terms of transformation? Digital transformation is kind of a watchword right now. It basically means you have to have a way of dealing with complexity and simplifying it and putting more information in the hands of the people who are doing the work so that they can be more efficient, more connected, and more accurate at what they do and cost less money. The speed and the velocity of everything is going up. The change to e-commerce has been dramatic. We're at a point now that we didn't expect to be in until probably almost 2030 in terms of adoption, nationwide and countrywide adoption of things like shopping online and getting your groceries delivered and so forth. So satisfying those customers is no simple matter, and the supply chain is complex. How do we go about dealing with that? Well, again, just to kind of reiterate, we're going to look at the process, the people, and the technology that is in place, as well as what could be in place, and recognize that all three of these are supported by GS1 standards to connect our operations to the entire supply chain. So we're going to talk about those four topics today in manners and forms. Are you ready? Are you ready to transform? Is your warehouse ready for the next new normal or the next disruption? If I were to take a walk into your warehouse and just do a front to back, I'm going to be looking for a couple of different things to find out where you are in your level of operational maturity. Do you have pervasive Wi-Fi throughout your warehouse? Are you using any automated scanning processes to track and trace? Do you have barcode scanners in your employees' hands? Are you using electronic Android-enabled devices to manage the workflow? If you're in a high velocity pick and pack operation, are you using voice to help optimize and keep those workers hands-free and efficient? And have you enabled any use of RFID for either ship confirmation or receipt confirmation to speed up the accuracy of those operations? These are the types of things I'd look for in your warehouse in terms of the processes that are in place. But some of the underlying technology is even much simpler than that. I'm going to look and see whether or not your warehouse has overhead signage identifying floor locations. Do you have your aisles clearly identified so that new employees can orientate themselves quickly within your environment? For picking, packing, putting away, and other operations that involve material handling, are all of your pallet racks clearly identified in a way that can be scanned by a user who's on the floor? Or by the user using material handling equipment? Can they get at that material? Can they identify where they are at quickly and easily using barcode scanning? And last but not least, is the product that's coming in the door, or is the product that you're producing properly identified using barcodes? Whether they're one-dimensional barcodes or two-dimensional barcodes, is the efficient information available? These are the types of things that determine whether or not you are ready for digital transformation and where you are in that process. So let's talk about that in operational maturity. We're going to use Zebra Technologies model of the warehouse maturity model, and it really is operational maturity, but it's in this case focused on the warehouse. And it starts off at the far left side in this blue rainbow of joy, I call it, the automation, analyze, and sense rainbow, so to speak. And we're starting off with just the basics. At level one, we're looking to just extend data capture out onto the floor so that you can start improving your operations and gaining some visibility over that. As you move from left to right in this cycle, you're going to add more connectivity and more granularity, where different workers might be using different tools to get their job done because it's more efficient for them to do it this way than it is to use a standard process or standard workflow across the entire warehouse. And kind of as you move forward, things get more complex. So let's zoom in on this just a little bit. For those of you who are my age, getting larger text on screen does help. But you can see that you're flowing from individual data capture of just getting the things done to how do I optimize getting things done better? How do I have more visibility over those operations? And how can I do some responsive and reactive planning to things that change in the event of just work getting done? Sometimes having location awareness allows you to reroute packages within your own facility, as opposed to using a fixed plan that was rolled out at 3 o'clock in the morning, because by 3 in the afternoon, the whole scenario was changed. Let's take a look at this in a little bit more detail and talk about what you'd expect to see at level 1. You're trying to gain basic control of your business operations, and then you're going to optimize. So you're pretty much at the entry level for barcoded data capture and data collection. It's worker-driven transactional data, and I would expect to see barcode devices, barcode scanning devices, wearable devices making use of voice as well. So you're going to see things like this within your warehouse: the handheld barcode scanners, the belt-worn or the wrist-worn barcode scanners, scanners mounted within that fork truck to allow them to both capture and control their experience and be able to report things back to the system. Now, as things get a little bit more finely tuned, as you start optimizing those processes and applying your Six Sigma to what's going on in your warehouse to make things better, or to what's going on within your distribution center to make things better and more efficient, then you start making use of real-time visibility to change plans on the fly. You're adding agility, and you're adding another level of information that may not necessarily require your workers to touch or do anything. Product in motion is enough to gather information in if you use an RFID. They're doing their jobs and the product's identifying itself by passing through sensors. Now, those sensors could include other IoT devices, such as temperature sensors, vibration sensors, motion sensors. All the types of things that we dream about are now getting miniaturized and applied sometimes directly to the product, if not to the truck or the equipment that's being used. Adding visibility through scanning and making use of optical technologies to add greater granularity and more visibility to your process and add controls to your automation. Getting down to the point where we're using robots and cobots and micro fulfillment centers, intelligent automation kind of being the peak of this. So our blue rainbow extends from just standard barcode data entry using your Motorola or Symbol devices or whoever, all the way down to the dark warehouse where things are happening automatically using automation. It's a pretty broad spectrum, and there's no wrong place to be on that spectrum. Wherever you're at now, you're in a good place to be able to improve things and move further along that spectrum. And everyone moves at their own rate. But be aware of where you are and what types of improvements you could make that are following an industry standard, so that you're not trying to invent this from the whole cloth. You can actually follow somebody else's model on how to do it right, what KPIs to look for, and how to optimize that process. So let's move a little bit away from the maturity model and start talking about some other topics. We mentioned GS1 standards and regulations. This is having a huge effect on the industry right now due to the amount of information that both the Canadian Food Inspection Agency and the FDA are going to require in the upcoming years. Let's talk about that in some detail. The Canadian Food Inspection Agency and the US Food and Drug Administration are basically using the same sets of rules. Food traceability crosses both borders, and the idea is we're trying to prevent bad things from happening. We don't want an outbreak of foodborne illness. So by adding greater levels of traceability and tracking requirements to the food distribution process, from the farm all the way to the retailer, we can prevent bad things from happening before it reaches the customer and be able to isolate it as much as possible to remove it from the supply chain to maintain the safety of our food. So GS1 standards are an important part of that. GS1 standards are used to identify, capture, share, and use information across the supply chain. UPC codes are just the barest tip of the iceberg on that. If we talk about all of the different pieces in play for end-to-end traceability, you have global location numbers, You have your G-tins, which are your UPCs, but for different types of packaging and size. Basically, depending on how it's containerized, it's the same product, just in a different volume. You've got serialized shipping container codes and serialized case codes, returnable asset identifiers, global individual asset identifiers. One thing to think about is if it's a noun, it's got an identifier. If it's a verb, it's probably got its own descriptor so that your communications about that end-to-end traceability is standardized worldwide. And all of this is blockchain ready. So even if you're not currently using blockchain, if you've implemented GS1 standards to identify your products and goods and to start identifying the places and people that are involved in that process, you are getting ready for blockchain and we'll be able to jump on that portion of the supply chain communications when you are ready and when it's available. So talking about what's happening, basically every single step of the way from manufacturing through to consumption is lot, batch, and serialized tracked so that every time you containerize something, you're paying attention to what got containerized into what and adding a serial number to that so that you can log that event and be able to get traceability throughout the supply chain. If you've paid attention to the pharmaceutical industry, they're already pretty far down this path. The food industry is just getting started on this path. They've got some of it, but not at the right level of batch and serialized granularity that they're going to need to satisfy future rules and regulations. So let's talk a little bit about that. The FSMA is the Food Safety Modernization Act. It's been around for 10 years now. The rules are slowly rolling forward because, let's be honest, the supply chain for food is huge. There are a lot of different players in there, and it's all encompassing. So what do you want to focus on? Well, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency and the FDA are focusing on something called the Food Traceability List. What's your food traceability list? Well, that's basically limited to the usual suspects for foodborne illness, i.e. Soft cheeses, seafoods, and produce. And what are they tracking in that process? Well, they're looking at all those critical tracking events, which means the creation, the first receiver, and I'll explain that in a little bit more detail in a moment, but then any transport or transformation event. They want to have traceability on those events so that they can track any issue back to one of those transformations. And what are they tracking? Those key data elements, lot codes, source information, origination and destination information, all your product identifiers. Again, all of your nouns, all of your verbs, but it's not covering the entire breadth of the food supply chain right now. It's limited to that food traceability list. So let's take a look at 3 examples, one for soft cheeses, one for seafood, one for produce, and look at that supply chain and what's going to be collected. So looking at soft cheeses, our key data elements and our critical tracking events start at the manufacturer. So we're not starting at the farm in this case. They're a raw material supplier of milk and salt. The manufacturer is responsible for creating the traceability for that cheese. As it passes through the distributor, they've got 2 events. They're receiving and they're shipping. On the retailer side, they're receiving. And you'll notice that the consumer is pretty much left to their own devices. They're not part of this process. If we take a look at seafood, whether it's shellfish or finfish, the requirements are a little bit different because the first receiver is the person or the organization that's buying that fish from the various vessels that come into harbor that day. So they're the ones applying lot code and traceability to those products. Whether it's tuna or shellfish, they're the ones responsible for identifying what that lot is and where they got it from. That's that receiving KDE. As it moves through the processor and the distributor and makes it through to the retailer, again, you've got those shipping and receiving events, but you also have transformation. If they bag it, if they shell it, if they combine it with other seafood, those are all transformation events. And lastly, let's take a look at produce. One of the biggest foodborne illness problems we had has involved things like romaine lettuce. Well, we want to get traceability all the way back to the grower for that. So we've got critical data events happening at the grower that are being tracked, and the receiver on the farm, the packer on the farm. All of these are places where foodborne illness can occur or start due to material handling requirements. And again, at the produce processor, who's going to receive in, for example, romaine lettuce from multiple farms and multiple organizations and package them all in one bag. That's their transformation. And again, if we take a look at the supply chain from end to end, it starts off, in this case, at the grower, and it finishes at the retailer. And those consumers are, again, left to their own devices. So as we move, and we talk a little bit more about that, when is all of this stuff going to come into play? The Food Safety Modernization Act, the traceability proposal, was only released in 2020. What do we expect for a timeline? I'm comparing the Food Safety Modernization Act on the right to the Drug Supply Chain Safety Act on the left. The Drug Supply Chain Safety Act was enacted in 2013, and it had a much shorter path because it involves a much smaller number of players. There's only a limited number of pharmaceutical companies in the world. So they were able to get together and lock down these traceability requirements, literally developing GS1 standards even further as they did so. The Food Safety Modernization Act is piggybacking on those GS1 standards and just enabling those portions of it that serve food safety. If we look at where the Drug Supply Chain Security Act is now, less than 7 years, they still haven't quite finished traceability throughout the entire process. The goal is traceability from the manufacturer all the way down to the patient dispensing. If you have a medication that you're receiving right now where it's in a blister pack, each one of those pills on the back of that blister pack has a unique serial number. Think about that. So we know, you can know by scanning that serial number that that particular pill can be traced all the way back to the manufacturer and through the supply chain effectively now. But you'll be able to do that at the caregiver and at the patient level by 2023. How does that compare to food safety modernization? Well, the traceability proposal is in place now, and producers are going to be required to comply with the key data elements and the critical tracking events. We expect the buyers and the processors and the manufacturers to be compliant at the exact same time because they're all first receivers in some case. And now, once the first receivers have their act together, we can move further down the supply chain. So the distribution centers the following year will be required to be compliant. And if we go one more year past that, finally we get to the retailers. So over the next 4 years, we expect the supply chain traceability rules to fall into place all the way down to the retail level. Now, this is going to give us, by 2025, FTL to fork, which is your food traceability list to fork, track and trace, if you've got visibility for the consumer on those products. There is actually a tool in place that allows consumers to have visibility into the supply chain. I'm going to talk about that on my next slide, but I want you to think about the traceability proposals that are in place. At the moment, by 2025, it's only limited to the food traceability list, just for, again, common sense products that are on the food traceability list that have been the usual suspects, soft cheeses, seafood, and producers. But if you're in that supply chain, you don't want to have an exception process for just a portion of the products that you deal with. So you will see these standards being extended by the industry to all products within the food supply chain, not just those that are on the food traceability list. Because if you've invested in the equipment and you're already tracking lot traceability for 3 items, you might as well track it for everything. Because it's going to be running through the same types of automation equipment, the same material handlers, and the same processes. If you walk into a distribution center, you may see your proteins being handled by a particular team because they're in the freezer, but they may also work in an area where they're dealing with, other frozen goods such as frozen vegetables or frozen fruits, and they're not going to want to change their process just because they're tracking fish. They want to have the same standard operating procedure for handling everything that's coming in and out of that freezer. So that's why I'm saying by 2027, the food traceability rules will effectively cover the entire food supply chain. Now let's talk about that to-mouth visibility. What are we talking about here? Well, there's a new GS1 standard called the Smart Label, and there's various organizations that have popped up to enable this to happen and make it easier for both the manufacturers and the retailers to give the consumer visibility to their product. It uses the QR code. which could be applied anywhere on the product. And you'll see these popping up, especially at Nestle and Chips Ahoy. You can see that the idea is you can scan that smart code label and it will either bring you to an app or bring you to a screen that gives you more information on that product. That promotes product transparency. It provides quick access to any branding. And since that granularity for that particular QR code is extendable, you literally could know exactly which box of chocolate that consumer is scanning if that serial number is included in that particular package. If there's any recalls that can be shared, they could scan that label and know what all the recalls might be so that they could avoid an issue that, maybe they bought their seafood at Aldi's and there was a recall that they weren't aware of because they've had it sitting in their freezer for more than 6 months. Well, the next time they open their freezer and they go, I wonder what's happening with this stuff, they can scan that QR code and see the recall notice and know that it's not safe for them to consume it. The whole concept of food safety modernization is getting power into the hands of the consumer to prevent foodborne illness and to get power, tools, and capabilities within the supply chain to be able to intercept and intercede to prevent any possible foodborne illness from getting to that consumer to begin with. So Bertrand, have you been monitoring our question and answer section at all?
Yeah, yes, I have been. And so I have some questions for you on the warehouse automation and the voice speaking technology.
Mm-hmm.
What productivity gain do you think you can realize on a voice speaking solution for picking case compared to either completely manual operation or a traditional handheld scanning solution?
We see probably at least a 15% uptick just going from barcodes to voice. And that's an industry standard. If you go from what I call grade 0, which is nothing, to voice, you're going to see an uptick in efficiency of about 30%. So that you can either look at that as velocity and say you're going to get 30% more product, or you can look at it as time savings and efficiency savings for your workforce, that they're 30% more efficient.
Okay. In terms of the RFID technology, is it part of any GS1 standard?
Yes, we're usually using the RAIN RFID standard, which is based upon passive RFID tagging. It's pretty much a worldwide standard now. The nice thing about using the RAIN RFID is you now have a little bit more predictability on what your expectations are for scanning, distance, range, density, and this type of thing for products. And we're not in the perfect world that Walmart wanted 10 years ago, where they could walk through a warehouse and see individual IDs on every single product just by scanning. But by making use of the GS1 containerization and putting RFID at every containerization level, along with those GTINs, they can get visibility and they can get readability for everything in the warehouse. Because if you know what box you put it in and you identify that box, you know where the product is. And if you know what pallet you put that box on, and you can identify that pallet, you can now get traceability down to the pallet and the product within it, down to the box level, down to the each level, using RFID.
Okay. Peter, if you can check the Q&A session, there is a question that just came in, very specific, if you can read it and answer.
Sure,
From
let me
Charles.
pop that open. So he's being rather super specific. So being an importer that frequently receives shipments from various suppliers, they've seen some of them using GS1 128 applications that we almost never see in North America. So making use of identifiers on a separate 2D barcode. Okay. Or putting a variable length identifier in the middle of the barcode. Right. So what people don't often recognize about the GS1 standards is that they're a bit fungible. If you've got combined or concatenated barcodes for GS1 standards, there's no particular order those fields can appear in some cases. So you could have the lot before the serial number after the GTIN, or you could have the lot after the serial number and before the date code. It really doesn't matter what order they're in. And that has blown up in the face of certain supply chains because they're not using GS1 standards to decode them, they're trying to break them apart using standard concatenation rules. So they try to have a format for what the GTIN is supposed to be scanned at. And it's not always fixed length fields. You do really have to pay attention to what that technology is capable of now. And if you're using a 2D barcode like they do in the pharmaceutical industry, they somewhat standardized on a format for the order of fields, but you can add additional fields if it's important to your portion of the supply chain without a problem. So you really have to be more flexible on what your decoding standards are.
So Charles, if you need more information, Peter is available to go in depth on GS1 related topics, and we can continue the conversation after that presentation.
Yeah, more than happy to.
Because GS1 can be a tricky subject. Another questions. Do you think that barcode technology will slowly be replaced by RFID, vision technology, or higher automation solutions?
No, and I'll say that very confidently. All of these solutions build on each other. The barcode is your base level. After your barcode, you're adding an RFID tag to make things hands-free and more efficient from a distance. But if for some reason that that RFID tag is damaged, you flex an antenna, there's an electromagnetic pulse that blows the chip, you still want to be able to identify that.
I think we just lost Peter.
Yeah, Peter just froze. So I think, oops. I think the answer is that barcode won't be replaced. It's still for lots of applications the most cost-effective solution that you can find to start tracking any data. And UHF RFID became a standard in 2000. Was supposed to replace the barcode, and it did not happen. And one of the key aspects was the physical limitation of the RFID technology. I don't see any other question at that time.
Il nous reste encore quelques minutes, donc peut-être que si Peter arrive à se reconnecter d'ici
On va voir.
les prochaines minutes, on pourrait comme ça continuer les échanges. En tout cas, si vous avez encore des questions, éventuellement les participants, n'hésitez pas à les poser maintenant, donc dans l'onglet Q&A ou dans l'onglet du chat. On va voir du coup si Peter arrive à se reconnecter, mais dans tous les cas, je pense que Bertrand pourra aussi répondre à vos questions, donc n'hésitez pas, profitez-en puisqu'il nous reste encore une dizaine de minutes.
Et ce qu'on va faire aussi, c'est qu'on... Elsa, est-ce que tu m'entends encore?
Je vous entends toujours.
Ah, ok. Je pensais que moi aussi, j'étais perdu dans la brume. Ok, je pense qu'il n'y a pas de questions et je pense que Peter, qui était de Baltimore, a perdu sa connexion.
Il semblerait effectivement malheureusement que Peter ait perdu la connexion.
En tout cas, merci d'avoir participé à notre présentation. Et comme je le dis, vous avez les coordonnées. On va mettre la présentation en ligne aussi après. Et si vous avez des questions plus pointues sur le côté automatisation de l'entrepôt ou toutes les questions sur GS1, n'hésitez pas à nous les envoyer.
Effectivement, n'hésitez pas à prendre les coordonnées de Bertrand ou de Peter pour leur communiquer vos questions si vous en avez a posteriori. Je vais profiter aussi du coup de la fin de cette dernière conférence de la journée déjà pour vous remercier, vous Bertrand. Vous transmettrez aussi mes remerciements à Peter qui malheureusement ne pourra pas les entendre. Je remercie encore tous les participants. Je sais qu'il y en a beaucoup qui ont suivi tous les webinaires entre hier et aujourd'hui. Donc vraiment, merci beaucoup pour votre présence et merci pour votre participation. Un grand merci aussi à Fidelio, bien sûr, pour organiser cet événement. Et n'hésitez pas, si vous voulez aller jeter un œil sur les prochains événements de Saloon, si vous voyez des choses qui peuvent vous intéresser, certes, c'est pas nécessairement lié à l'agroalimentaire, mais au cas où, n'hésitez pas à regarder s'il y a des choses qui vous intéressent. Et puis surtout, pareil, n'hésitez pas à laisser éventuellement un petit avis sur chaque conférence que vous avez pu voir. Vous avez la possibilité de faire ça et de noter les conférences. N'hésitez pas à donner vos feedbacks, ça fera toujours plaisir. Et c'est toujours bon aussi à prendre, que ce soit pour nous ou les organisateurs et conférenciers. Merci encore infiniment, Bertrand. Puis du coup, je vais
Aucun
vous souhaiter à
plaisir.
tous un bon après-midi, une bonne journée et à très bientôt du coup.
Merci. Au revoir.
Au revoir à tous.